Good morning and afternoon, everybody. My name is Janie Montblanc, and I am the Great Basin Science Delivery Project Coordinator. Welcome to our webinar, Are We Getting What We Expect? Short-Term Response by Bird Communities to Pinyon-Juniper Reductions, presented by Dr. Steve Knick from the USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center. If you have questions at any point during the webinar, you may send me a direct message by expanding your control panel on the top right of your screen to access your questions pane. I will show up as the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. So even though it's me, it shows that instead of my name. You can also click the hand icon in your control panel to raise your hand, and I will type you a response. Usually it'll be something like, how can I help you? If you have questions for our presenter, you are also welcome to type them in at any time, but I will field these questions at the end of the presentation. If you would like to ask your question directly, please type me a message that says unmute me, and I will unmute you at the end of the presentation in the order in which the request was received. Now I would like to introduce our presenter. Steve Knick is a research ecologist at the USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center who has worked in sagebrush systems in the western United States for over 25 years. His research is focused on the role of human and natural disturbance in shaping ecological systems, the effects of multi-scale habitat characteristics on passerine bird communities, and the use of GIS techniques and satellite imagery to characterize landscapes in semi-arid regions. He was a lead scientist providing information for 2 listing decisions by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on greater sage-grouse. He's an editor and author of the book Greater Sage-Grouse, Ecology and Conservation of a Landscape Species and Its Habitat, published this spring by the University of California Press as a volume in the series Studies in Avian Biology. Welcome, Steve, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Janie, and thank you to the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center and the Great Basin Science Delivery Project for making this all happen, and for those of you who are listening in and will participate in this webinar. Janie mentioned a lot about sage-grouse in my biology or biography, and this is a chance for me to show that I actually have another life outside of sage-grouse, and that one of my primary interests has been in the smaller birds, the passerine birds in sagebrush systems, and how they respond to the kind of disturbances that are happening in their systems, and that their sagebrush habitats are changing rapidly due to a variety of reasons, and it's often been called the great squeeze as to what's happening to them. And so at the lower extreme, then, we have a situation where fires are increasing because of exotic grass called cheatgrass that's coming into the system. And so we're losing habitat at lower elevations, and particularly in some of the drier habitat areas. But at the upper extreme, which is the area that I'll be talking about today, woodlands are also encroaching or expanding into sagebrush from higher elevations and moving downslope into areas that were previously dominated by sagebrush. And there are a variety of reasons why this is happening, and some of it has been debated about the role of fire exclusion, livestock grazing, and all of that. But really, what I'm going to talk about today is what happens when we use these kind of manipulations to try and reduce the amount of woodland area, and if these kind of treatments actually do benefit the sagebrush bird community. And so today what I'm going to present is some of the preliminary analyses that we've been doing on our project that's been funded by the Joint Fire Sciences Program and through the Sage-Step project. The Sage-Step project, many of you may know, is a consortium of a large number of scientists and different entities and agencies, and we're looking at a variety of things associated with these treatments in woodlands and in sagebrush zones, everything from the faunal response, which is the bird community and the butterfly community, the vegetation responses, as well as some of the sociological and economic effects of these kind of treatments. And so it's been a large project scattered over several states in the western part of the sagebrush ecosystem, and within 2 networks, the juniper network or the woodland network, and then the sagebrush network. We've been doing the bird work only in the woodland network, largely because of the opportunity to look at a greater variety of birds than we would in the lower elevation systems, but also then to look at how these changes might influence the distribution of this ecotone, so that the sagebrush and the vegetation structure are changed in the response by the bird community then to these changes. And so, like I say, what we're focused on is that ecotone then that's between the lower elevation sagebrush and the woodlands in the higher elevation. And there are a lot of different photos taken at different time series that show how woodlands have the distribution have changed, and we'll get some semantics out of the way to begin with in terms of whether it's an invasion, an expansion, encroachment, or whether if you go back in time far enough it's actually a reclamation. But nonetheless, woodlands are changing. The distribution is changing and moving into areas that previously were dominated by sagebrush communities. And so we have this ecotone between the sagebrush and the woodland communities, and this ecotone is not a static location, and it's fluctuated over time. And in recent years, the last century or so, that ecotone has moved more and more towards the sagebrush, down into the sagebrush zone as the woodlands have been expanding into this area. And our goal with management is to try and then set that back or reduce the amount of woodland there and move that ecotone back upslope and provide more sagebrush habitat for the bird communities. And so we talk about it again in semantics in terms of treatments and prescriptions, and we're going to restore things and all that. The reality is what we're doing is we're putting some kind of disturbance onto the system and hoping to change the vegetation structure to something dominated by a different characteristic community, in this case sagebrush community. What a bird knows, if you kind of filter this through the little brain of a bird, is that all of a sudden the things that it's looking for in its selection have changed or are no longer there. If it was a bird that was born there or bred there previously, once we do the treatment and it comes back, if there's some form of site fidelity and it comes back, all it knows is that the structure has changed, and so what it may have been used to in the past or what it's looking for may no longer be there. There are also other birds who may not have been born there, floaters in the system, who are looking for a place to breed during the summertime, and what they're looking for in the selection then is whether or not the kind of characteristics that are there are going to meet what they want for their breeding opportunities. And so this change, what we're hoping then is that these changes in the vegetation structure will also result in some kind of a change in the bird community. And so the question is, are we getting what we expect? And I realize that's a loaded question, because a bit of a loaded question in that what is it that we really expect to begin with? Do we really expect that with some of the treatments that we do that we're going to see large responses in populations? Do we expect that we're going to reverse some of the trends that we've been seeing in the juniper woodland expansion zones? And so what is it that we expect? And one of the things that I think we all too often expect, and if we're working in the western United States and in the sagebrush range, is one of the things that we expect is that the treatments that we're doing in these pinyon-juniper woodland areas are going to benefit sage-grouse, and that we're going to see that response within a fairly short time. And so I want to just briefly talk about that in the problems with using sage-grouse as a species by which we should measure the response and our expectation, and also then why we've selected or chosen to go with this passerine bird or the smaller birds in these communities, because of the opportunity to actually see some of the responses as a result of the treatments. And I realize there are a lot of other reasons for doing treatments in pinyon-juniper woodlands and other areas to alter some of the hydrological problems that are going on with total dominance by juniper and things like that. But again, many of the treatments that I'm associated with are being done either explicitly or with an expressed interest to benefit sage-grouse. So I want to acknowledge the two co-authors with me and who worked with me on this project for a number of years, Steve Hanser and Matthias Loy. And as I was looking at this picture and realizing they're twins, it's interesting that Steve was born in Iowa and Matthias was born in Switzerland, and so just an interesting example of parallel evolution going on here. But again, both have contributed significantly to this project. I also decided last week that I was going to show this particular slide in every presentation I give from now on. And the reason being is that the description of an ecological system is so important as to how we interpret the results of what it is we do within the landscape and where it is in this organizational level that we should expect to see results not only in space but also in different time scales. And so we do treatments, even some very large treatments, at this area of individual sites. We seldom work with the individual shrubs, but we work at sites. And oftentimes we expect then, as a result of these treatments in sites, to see a response in populations. And that's not likely with many of the wide-ranging populations that we're dealing with in the sagebrush system, and particularly with sage-grouse, as I'll show in just a little bit. And so it may be more appropriate that where we expect to see the response is among individuals within that site. Collectively, we may be able to influence enough sites that we can alter populations, increase or change the structure. But again, the area at which we should probably be looking at not only the level of disturbance that we do, but the response then somewhere within individuals, but certainly not necessarily in the larger regional populations or even in the landscapes. The time at which we're expecting to see some of this response as well then is not going to be measured immediately, in many cases in terms of a year or even 2 years, but with sage-grouse it may be 20 to 25 years. This organization isn't anything new. As you can see, it's been around for several centuries, but it really gets confused and mismatched. Many of the kind of meetings I sit in and talking about treatments and response, we have much greater expectation on what we're actually going to influence as a result of the treatment that we do. Sage-grouse are driving just about everything we're doing in the sagebrush system right now, and ideally, we would have looked at sage-grouse and whether or not we could see a response, but there's some problems with using sage-grouse. They have a very large home range, for instance, and most of the time the size of the treatment that we do is very small within the size of the home range. Sage-grouse are also relatively long-lived, so we're going to see some kind of a lag period in the response to any kind of a change in habitat. Even with a disturbance that removes habitat, there's a lot of site fidelity, and there's with sage-grouse up to a 4 or 5 year lag period before you start seeing a lot of the population response as a result of the impact of disturbance itself. To see the recovery is going to take even longer, as I mentioned, 20 to 25 years in some cases. Sage-grouse have a relatively low reproductive rate, so there just isn't really the intrinsic rate of growth in the population that we're going to see a rapid response. Ideally, like I say, we would have studied sage-grouse, and they would have been perfect because of the publicity and they're charismatic and all that kind of stuff. But in the 14 sites that we've been working at, we've only had a handful of observations of sage-grouse. There was one nest that was found on the Aniki site, and some males have been observed there, but and Castlehead may have had a nest on it as well. But this isn't anything over the time frame that we're doing the study to have any kind of a measurable response by which we can estimate the kind of change that we're expecting or to document the changes or the benefits. As I mentioned, this whole idea of what size of disturbance we have relative to the territory or home range. And if we look at the typical treatment size of what we might do for and the range that sage-grouse use, it's going to be in a very small part of the size of the range that sage-grouse normally use. Also, these treatments in woodland areas are often in marginal habitats at best for sage-grouse, so they just aren't using them to begin with, and so our ability to detect a response is going to be minimal at best. So sage-grouse are considered an umbrella species in that anything that we might do for sage-grouse is assumed to benefit a suite of other species that live in sagebrush systems. And so the reverse also may be true then, that if we can document changes in the sagebrush bird community, that may ultimately translate into changes for that we could expect over a longer time period are also going to benefit sage-grouse. If these birds are going to be in that system, it's likely that at some point sage-grouse also may use that system if this link between umbrella species and the sagebrush obligate species is very strong. And so the other advantage of using the smaller birds, primarily passerine birds, is that they typically have much smaller home range sizes. And so in an area then, if you consider these as a territory or range size of an individual species, and it can be a brewer, sparrow, gray flycatcher, whatever you want it to be at this point, it's fairly easy then to map or to consider that a large number of individuals are going to be in the landscape that we're working in. One of the things that attracted me about this Sage Step project is that the size of the treatment wasn't going to be small relative to the number of territories that we might influence. And if we look at it this way, in some of the treatments that we might do in mechanical or some other areas, just because of the expense, are going to be very small in area and would influence a small number of individuals. But when we're talking about 1,000-acre treatments and larger, the opportunity to influence a large number of individuals is significant. And so what we were hoping is that with this treatment of this size, we would be able to detect measurable changes in the bird community and at the spatial scales at which this was done. As I said, we're talking about this ecotone area, and one of the things that we've been able to do on this project by doing the bird surveys is that we've been able to include birds that are typical sagebrush obligate birds, as well as those birds that are using the ecotone, and our sites also extend up into the woodland areas themselves. And so we have this suite of species defining the bird community by those that are using the woodland areas, those that are using the ecotone areas, as well as those that are using the sagebrush areas below this ecotone. And so there's the opportunity, by looking at the entire community, to be able to try and understand how changes might be happening within that entire suite of birds that comprise the community. And so the objectives just overall are to delineate the organization of the bird communities. What is the structure? What are the primary environmental gradients that are structuring these bird communities? And then can we use changes in the bird community to interpret the effects of what we're doing with these management treatments? And our project is set up, and we have a number of different things that we're doing with the project, and this is just kind of a schematic of the different things we're looking at, not only the patterns of changes, but ultimately to get at some of the mechanisms by which the change in the bird community is expressed, whether it's through productivity some way or breeding, number of breeding adults, but again, the mechanisms, not just the pattern of change. And so what I'm going to talk about today then is just really one small part of it, and that's the community composition and how that might change as a result of treatment from pre-treatment community to a post-treatment community, and can we then use that change as a way to evaluate the effectiveness of influencing or benefiting sagebrush birds. This is a large study in that we have 14 sites within the woodland network, and they include areas in the western juniper region, the pinyon-juniper region, primarily in Nevada, and then also sites in the Utah juniper. And the hope was that we could actually, by looking at the gradient of sites, although they were all dominated by woodland and juniper, in pinyon in some cases, could we detect similarities among these sites then that would allow us to say what sorts of things, what kind of effects of the treatments were the primary ones that were driving the changes in the bird community, as well as then what would be some of the thresholds by which we needed to do a treatment either in size or intensity of the treatment to influence the bird community in the way that we were hoping. And so we have at each of these sites then set up a series of not only point counts to look at changes in the bird community composition, but as I mentioned, territory mapping and things that are going to give us information on the mechanisms by which the changes are expressed. If we look at these network of sites and use an ordination, which is a way to kind of look at the gradient of sites, we see that there is a gradient across these different three zones that can be expressed in a statistical space. And so that even though they are all dominated by a woodland condition, that there are gradients that are evident among the suite of, or the set of sites that we have, the 14 sites in the woodland network. And those primary gradients are latitude, but also then some species composition, the presence or absence of juniper or pinyon in some of the sites, as well as elevation. And so there are some differences among the sites, and these are the primary gradients along which these sites are organized, and that may make a difference in how these different treatments are act out or play out in the response that we see in the bird community. At each of the sites, we have a paired study design, and the whole idea was, it was kind of, I guess we had hoped ideally that we could have these paired study sites that would have identical treatment and control areas. And as I'll show in a little bit, that was pretty naive to think that at the level of a landscape, 1,000 acres or more, we could actually find two paired areas that were going to be exactly like each other. And of course the hypothesis being that if these were exactly alike and the only thing that were then the difference were the treatment, we could attribute the change to the treatment itself. And we hope that these 14 sites would also be somewhat replicates rather than individual case studies. That may not actually work out, but again, some of the analyses that we will do coming up will tell us the extent to which they actually can be used as a replicate, or there are such differences among the individual sites or among the regions that we cannot do that. So we have this treatment and control area. Each is 1,000 acres or larger in size. Within those areas, then, we had the opportunity to do at least 1 year of pre-treatment work, and then before the treatment was imposed upon it, either through fire, there was also mechanical and some other control types of treatments used, but I'm going to focus only on the burn treatments today. We then did breeding point transects that were put in each of the sites, both in the treatment and the control area, to look at overall bird numbers as well as the community composition. Each of the bird points then was accompanied by 2 vegetation plots, so that we would be able to develop relationships between what we're seeing on the point counts, as well as then characterize the vegetation in the area that would be surrounding that point count. Also use ordinations, and much of what you'll see from this point on is the result of some of the ordination analyses that we do. I use ordinations for 2 reasons. The first is that ordinations are a wonderful way to try and demonstrate a pattern or a gradient in what may be a random scatter plot of points in statistical space. And so I have the opportunity to try and convince myself that there's a pattern there, and then also to convince you that there may be a pattern. And I use ordinations to do that. The other reason I use ordinations is simply that they're a good way to describe a community and the primary factors that are structuring a community as opposed to individual species. Even though we may be managing in many cases for an individual species like sage-grouse, the reality is what we're interested in is the community response, and that community, whether it's vegetation or the bird community, is best described within these ordinations. And so ordinations are a good way to look at how communities then respond or change. And so we have these point transects that are put in each of the 14 sites within the network, and we've used a standard spacing of at least 600 meters between individual point count locations. And we used a regular spacing rather than a random spacing just so that we could get maximum coverage within the treatment and the control areas. And this just shows you the arrangement of these sites. The point counts were spaced far enough so that we wouldn't be duplicating counts of birds from one site to the next, and again, each of these sites has at least 2 vegetation points that are within 200 meters of the point count itself so that we can characterize the vegetation. The typical vegetation sampling is fairly standard, using line intercept counts and different ways to estimate the percent of ground cover, density of foliage and things like that, and so to be able to adequately characterize the vegetation in each of these areas, as well as then good enough to be able to detect changes both before and after treatments in terms of number of trees, the dead shrubs, things like that. Ordinations, as I say, are a way to describe communities, and this is just a kind of a standardized ordination. And what they do is they take this scatter plot of points and arrange them in some statistical way so that you can see the primary elements that are structuring or arranging the community composition. And to show you that in an actual ordination of birds within a sagebrush and juniper woodland area, then if you know about the species themselves, you can start to interpret some of the relationships that you see within an ordination like this. And particularly, we can start looking at different parts of this ordination and notice which birds, for instance, belong in our shrubland birds, which birds are grassland birds, those birds within the ecotone areas, as well as woodland birds. And so without even knowing some of the underlying environmental gradients that may be structuring this, we can start making some assumptions about the patterns of the species, the community that's using this system. And then when we add the vegetation to these analyses themselves, we can get the primary gradients that are underlying the bird community composition. And those gradients then aren't necessarily along the axis 1 or 2, but rather can be in different directions. And so, for instance, in this community, the one that I just showed you, tall sagebrush, was a primary vegetation value that was structuring the community in this direction, juniper down in this direction, and forbs in this direction. And so if we look at these as axes, then what we're hoping to do is see a change along one of these axes that we would relate to our treatment. And so we can take, one of the things we can do is take the bird community at any single time and plot a centroid for that community. And that shows up at some point in statistical space within this ordination. And if we then do this over time, we see that that centroid might change. And again, within several sampling periods, that we develop some sense of the space within that community varies. And that's due to yearly variation and things like that. But overall, we have some sense of the boundaries of the community and how it's structured as to how it operates over time. What we hope to do with the treatments then is alter the vegetation so that we move that community that's in those treatment areas into a new point in the statistical space, and that over time being able to again track the community changes that we can detect. It will ultimately have a new center and a new kind of zone or centroid around which that community is organized. And so that hopefully we can detect that within some of the treatments that we do, and that's what kind of the pattern of what I'll be showing you for two of the sites within the network, the Five Creeks site as well as at the Anarchy location. And so the Five Creeks site is the first one that I'll talk about, and this is in southeastern Oregon, and it's an area that is dominated by juniper at the higher elevations, and also then extends down into sagebrush systems at some of the lower elevations. And so we had, again, a treatment and a control area, and areas then that the burn was fairly complete in that area as well in terms of places that were burned. But what you'll see is that many trees were still left in the area, and so although we burned much of the area, the vegetation structure itself did not change all that much. And so the question then is, are we moving the system in the right place, and can we detect that change? And so again, the Five Creeks area was burned in the fall of 2008. We had an opportunity to collect pretreatment data prior to the burn, which was conducted in the fall. It's at relatively high elevation, and the primary vegetation characteristics, as you can see, juniper, mountain big sagebrush, and some low sagebrush. It was a fairly complete burn in that 83% of the points that were associated with these point counts were burned. And if we actually sum the area within those burned plots, a large amount of the area actually burned or had evidence of a burn. However, like I say, as you can see in the picture, much of the structure didn't change a great deal. This is some NAPE imagery in 2005 as opposed to 2009, and if you're able to at least look, you can see there's still a fair amount of junipers that are left in this area, and if we zoom in a little bit closer to one of the specific point counts themselves, there's a lot of dead trees that are still standing there, but there's still a fair amount of juniper that's still left at many of these places. And then just a couple of examples of some before and after the treatment, some of the vegetation plots that we collected in 2008 as well as, again, in response in 2011. And so to look at the bird community on the area, and we've taken the most common species, and I admit that we may be not seeing the whole picture, but by not including the very rare species that show up. But again, what we're looking for is some of the changes, particularly among those birds that would be considered the sagebrush obligate species themselves. And so this is how the bird community was structured, and when we apply the vegetation to it, we see the primary gradients in the direction of mountain big sagebrush, low sagebrush, this direction down in juniper, as well as grass forb. And so if we look at then how the centroids of the treatment and the control have moved over the time frame, and again, this is now the real data compared to that idealized schematic that I showed earlier, and I've kept those primary environmental axes just so you can see, are we moving in the right direction? The first thing to note is that the treatment and the control are not exact replicates of each other, and they're in fact very different in terms of the vegetation structure. With the treatment being into more of a juniper and grass forb area, much of the control sites being dominated more by a low sage and mountain big sagebrush area. So we're not exactly replicates, but we're still able then, are we still able to see some changes within as a result of the treatment. So the treatment was conducted in 2008, and like I say, we had the pre-treatment information here. The direction the bird community changed in 2009 was in a direction away from the juniper area and towards the grass forb area and potentially towards a little bit more of the mountain big sagebrush. So we did see a shift in the bird community on this treatment area that we would, in the direction that we would expect. And if we go 2010, we're continuing to see that shift even more in the direction away from the woodland-dominated community towards one that is dominated or more characteristic of a grass four bird community. A little bit of a change in 2011, but again, within the time frame since the treatment, we're seeing a new kind of community structure emerging at this point. And again, I think these results, this is 3 years post-treatment, and whether or not we've settled on a new equilibrium or not, again, the time frame that we're looking at for these responses is going to be much longer than what we typically see in a study where we only follow the effects of treatment for 1 or 2 years. The control pretty much varied around a fairly small part over in that part of statistical space. Where were the changes expressed? For the most part, there was no increase in any of the sagebrush obligate birds on these treatment sites. In fact, because of the loss in the shrub cover, there was a little bit of a decrease in those birds that are the sagebrush obligates on the site. So certainly no increase at all. The primary change within these sites was on changes of those bird species that were in the ecotones that lost habitat. And for example, in this case, the gray flycatcher. Here's the treatment time period, and if we look at those on the treatment areas in each successive years, fewer and fewer gray flycatchers are showing up at this site. We didn't have a lot of change in the tree structure, or as I mentioned before, we went from about 12% down to about 6% in the trees, and from about 10 or 11% down to 4 or 5% in the shrub cover. So again, what we see is a loss of shrubland birds, also a loss of gray flycatchers in some of these ecotone species. And if we look again at those birds, no change, a number of species with very little change. There were some winners that made a quick response to the burn itself. The primary losers, gray flycatcher, green-tailed towhee, those birds that are in the ecotone. Species richness remained the same. We didn't change the structure enough so that species were added or species were lost as a result of the treatment. So we'll move over then. Is this a case study, or is this a replicate, and do we see this at a different site? And so we're going to go over to the Utah juniper site, and in this case the Anarchy area, and look at whether or not the bird community response was the same. And again, an area with juniper scattered throughout a lot of the sagebrush area, and we'll look at some of the point count information and those changes. It was burned in the fall of 2006. We had pre-treatment data at that time, and so we actually have 5 years of post-treatment data. Again, fairly high elevation, but dominated by Utah juniper, in this case, Wyoming big sagebrush, some bunch grasses, as well as then there's cheatgrass that's present in here. Again, a reasonably complete burn, in that 65% of the points associated did burn, and within those plots, not quite half of the area actually was burned. But again, we didn't change the vegetation structure all that much, so we didn't expect to see a very large change in any of the bird community. This is the actual burn boundary, and of the burn boundary itself, you can see a lot of the area, even though we had point counts scattered throughout here, there was very little of the total area that was actually burned. And again, a before and after picture of what we see, with some loss of shrubs as well as some dead junipers in the area as well. The bird community structure, again, as we might expect, we have the sagebrush obligate bird species down here, some of the grassland species up here, and then more of the woodland bird species over here. And in fact, when we do the add the vegetation components to the ordination, then we pick up these primary gradients of being perennial grass in this direction, juniper in this direction, and again, Wyoming big sagebrush down in this direction. And so again, I've kept these primary gradients so you can see how the changes might occur. And so I'm going to do this in a little bit different and looking just at the pairwise changes among each year, because if I try and plot the trajectories together for both treatment and control, it just gets to be looking like a radar, an air traffic control thing with all the different trajectories and lines going around. But again, the control and the treatment in statistical space, not really replicates. But again, we're hoping that we might be able to see some response in the treatment in the direction we would expect it to go. So here's the trajectory then going from 2006 to 2007. A really large change as a result, perhaps as a result of the treatment, going in the direction, again, away from some of the sagebrush area and some of the juniper up into more of a grassland, but still largely within a juniper-dominated system. The control, again, some change again in a somewhat similar direction. And if we look at 2008, again, a fairly large change in the community structure of both systems, although they're both going in the same direction in this particular year along this first axis of the ordination. And if we go 2008, we have opposite directions on the y-axis, on the y-axis, but similar directions somewhat on the x-axis. But again, they appear to be operating fairly independently. And if we go again 2009, just totally divergent trajectories among the treatment and the control bird community and their trajectories over this time. And if we look at 2011, again, divergent trajectories into how the bird communities within the treatments and control are operating. And if we plot the centroids or ellipsoids that are going to encompass this, it's really problematic to say that we've had a major effect on the system itself, and if we have, has it been in a direction that we would expect it to go? Looking again at what species have responded, and again, if we look at the sagebrush obligate birds within the treatments, there's virtually no change in those sagebrush obligate bird species within the treatment sites, and in fact a decrease initially as a result, probably a loss of the shrub areas. But again, many of these changes, at least the pattern is mirrored in the control site as well. Again, primary bird species that change are those that are in the ecotone. The losers, in this case, again, the gray flycatcher, that have much lower numbers as a result of the loss of the juniper as a result of the treatment. And so, again, we did not change the tree or shrub structure all that much as we go from, again, tree cover in the treatment area from a little less than 10% down to about 9% or so. There's a lot of trees still left in the system, some reduction a little bit in the shrub cover itself, going from about 14 down to 12, but again, even though we had the burn, we didn't alter the vegetation structure that much from the standpoint of the bird community. And in fact, species richness remained the same. We didn't add species or lose species. The losers, again, the gray flycatcher is one of the big losers. Most of the bird species, including the ones that I've put in green here, the sagebrush obligates, no change at all statistically and before or after the treatment as a result of the treatment. This site, probably more than many of the others, does reflect some of the things that are happening that confound our ability to detect change that's a result of the treatment. This is a number of western meadowlarks in the Oniki site. As you can see, the same general pattern, regardless of whether it's treatment or control. And so what we're seeing is that there's a lot of other things that may influence the number of birds in a community besides dynamics that are at that individual site. And in fact, the larger regional population trends may be swamping a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the community response. And so if we look at it in this diagram, we have the larger community, which we've measured by the number of birds detected on the breeding bird surveys, that may be, again, influencing what we see. We've looked at that for these sites by looking at the correlation among bird numbers counted on the breeding bird survey routes that surround each of these treatment zones and study sites, and then using the same kind of, putting them in the ordination, looking at how the changes in those are related to changes in the bird community at the individual site. And as we can see, the changes that we see in the bird community on the control sites is very highly correlated with the regional changes in numbers that we see on the bird communities. However, treatment results were not at all correlated at all with either the results on the breeding bird surveys or with the bird communities on the control sites. So clearly the treatment is having some effect if the direction of that community response has not been adequately stabilized yet over the time frame at which we're looking at. But there is an effect, again, of the larger regional dynamic influencing what we're seeing on our control and potentially then our ability to interpret some of what we're seeing. So just to kind of sum it up, and here's where I throw in a lot of the different caveats, that the treatment and control differ in community structure and their trajectory. And again, we had hoped that we would have a series of replicates not only at each location but also among the 14 sites. But once again, I'm reminded of an observation made by my colleague John Rotenberry that the world is a far more interesting place than a balanced ANOVA design. And so that's really an important thing, that as well as ability to detect what are the thresholds and what are the effects of these treatments, and can we translate that into some kind of a predictable response. And that's what much of our subsequent analyses, that we look at individual changes not only in some of the nesting and productivity characteristics that may be able to help us sort out how the community changes, not only as but the pattern of what is changing. The short-term response to treatments isn't that birds are increasing in numbers. The sagebrush steppe birds that we're hoping to benefit don't increase at these areas, maybe because of the response to the shrub loss that's also occurring as a result of treatment. Rather, the primary response is by those who lose habitat within this area. So therefore, the improvements that we expect to see for sagebrush obligates ultimately may be much farther into the future than what we may be initially expecting as a result of this. And so and that regional dynamics are also important. So to answer the initial question of, are we getting what we expect, I'm not sure that what we expect from the bird community is the response that we're seeing. And so that's one of the things then that as we continue to do these treatments and look at how the vegetation structure changes, hopefully we can be able to get the response that we expect if we look in the appropriate spatial and temporal scales. We were looking at one point and trying to see if at individual sites, if we could detect a change among individuals themselves. And the reality was that even though much of the area burned, there were too few sites that actually started with trees and didn't have any trees left to be able to go from to have a complete burn. So we may need to do much more intensive treatments at some of these sites if we're going to get the vegetation response that's going to influence the bird community. I'll put a warning on that, in that sometimes we also have to be careful in what we expect for a vegetation response if we go to some or more of these intensive treatments. And I think that will be the topic of some of the future presentations by people who are looking at vegetation response in this network on the Sage Steppe project. And I'd also, again, mention that the regional dynamics are important in at least the bird community and what it is we're seeing for a response. To conclude then, I'd just like to acknowledge the Fire Science Program, which has funded this work, the Sage Steppe project, which has been just a really valuable collaboration among scientists and different entities and interests and expertise that have really started looking at a holistic part of the system. USGS for their support, as well as the logistical support provided by the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, the many field technicians who've done the work for us. And lastly, I'd just like to thank those people who make the fires happen. And from the planning of the different burns to conducting them and making sure that we have these treatments that give me such a wonderful opportunity to be able to try and look at the bird response. So with that, I'll turn it over, and I'm not sure how the question and answers work, but we'll take any questions that we can at this point.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you everyone for hanging in there with the technical difficulties. And if you have to leave now, I just want to let you know before we start the questions that this video will be automatically sent to you via the GoToWebinar system, and it will also be posted on our website probably by early next week. And if it's all right with Steve, also we can post the presentation to the Great Basin Science Delivery Project website as well.
Do we just question, do we have both presentations, the one where I was talking to myself, or just
just the yeah, we'll have both. I'll edit it.
Okay.
Okay, and you had asked me to unmute Steve Hanser, so I'm doing that now in case he can answer some questions. Okay, so if you have questions, we have a few to start out with. You can type in your questions, or if you would like to ask them quote-unquote in person, you can ask me to unmute your microphone, and we can try that too. The first question is from Katie Feit, and she asks, there have been extensive veg treatments conducted by Nevada BLM and Forest Service to promote livestock grazing, including seeding crested wheatgrass. How are you taking this manipulation of veg communities into account in understanding baseline conditions and responses to these newest treatments? How are you taking livestock grazing into account as well? Are your treated sites grazed or fenced off?
There were some initial agreements that grazing would be excluded from some of the areas, but would be allowed back onto some of the sites after the research was conducted. Grazing was excluded from some of the smaller control or smaller treatment areas, but not over the larger areas.
Okay, thanks. The next question is from James Catlin. In 5 creeks, did you have grazed and ungrazed data? You might have just answered that.
I'd call on Steve. Do you have a further clarification of that?
The entire 5 Creek site is within allotment areas that are currently grazed.
So it's all grazed, not grazed and ungrazed?
Yes, it's all grazed.
Okay. Thanks. The next question is from John McLaughlin. Did you assess changes to the bird-veg community response when vertical structures were removed?
We've collected some of that information, although for this initial analysis I've just used the ground cover values, not necessarily the change in vertical structure. There still is, as you can see, a lot of the either dead trees standing or many of the other junipers, live junipers still remaining. So I'm not sure quite how to measure some of the vertical parts, but again, there still is enough of the existing juniper vegetation still there that the community has not changed a lot.
Okay, thank you. Those were all the questions that were typed in so far. Does anyone have any further questions? Okay, well, all right, well, I guess that's it then. So I just wanted to reiterate that the recording of this webinar will be sent to you automatically through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow, and will also be posted on the Great Basin Science Delivery Project website by early next week. And if you have more questions regarding this webinar or other topics, oh, there's more questions. Okay, well, I'll finish my sentence. What I was saying, if you have further questions and we don't address them here, you're always welcome to email me later, and we can try to get you an answer in a timely fashion. Okay, we have another question. This one's from Rob Lossinger. I hope I said your name right. Longsinger. Understanding that the costs of mechanical treatments may limit their spatial application, would you expect mechanical treatments that retain the shrub cover to have a more rapid response in positively influencing sagebrush obligates?
You know, I think it would, and just because you're able to maybe more completely remove some of the taller vertical structures within there, but still retain the shrub cover within that community itself. We've got mechanical sites as well. The problem is that, as you mentioned, the size of the treatment themselves is going to really preclude being able to understand maybe much more than an individual response to that treatment itself. But I would expect that it may have a very different response in the bird community because you're able to retain the sagebrush within that community. In other words, being more selective in what you're removing as a result of the treatment.
Thank you. John McLaughlin, he had asked the prior question about if you had assessed changes to the bird or veg community response when vertical structures were removed, asked what about cutting down the burned snags? I guess,
would I expect to see a change?
I guess, did you assess changes with cutting down burned snags? If you didn't, would you expect a change?
Well, we have not assessed a change specifically to cutting down the snags. I'm not sure that I would expect to see much of a change. Maybe in some of those species that are using the snags for perches or for cavity nesting or something like that, but I don't know that you would, by cutting those down, you'd see much of a response in the sagebrush birds as long as there was still a fair number of live trees still present.
Okay, thanks. Brandon Napton asks, are there any opportunities to look at cutting treatments to minimize the structure issues?
There are, but as was pointed out previously, the ability to do that over the size at which, spatial scale at which we might need to do it is really cost prohibitive.
Okay, thanks. David Dobkin asks, if you had the opportunity to repeat the study, what would you like to see different in the design aside from better match of treatment and control?
I would, getting the kind of fires that we would need to change the vegetation structure. Fire is not a very controllable thing many times, and so we initially started with the design that we could select areas to begin with, and one of those areas was going to be burned. The reality was that we ended up having to take areas that were going to be burned maybe in places that were less than ideal for what we were wanting to look at, and then trying to adapt our study design and find a control area to a treatment that was being planned. And so we were kind of ad hoc in the planning as opposed to being able to come up with two sites and then have the ability to say, yes, we're going to burn that site. That was probably the one thing that I would, if I could change, I would have done. Because it led to an unevenness in terms of when we were be able to conduct the treatments, as well as then the kind of environmental controls at which we had and geographical controls over what we had on where the treatment was conducted.
Okay, and that response might have answered the next question, but Justin Feeman asked, what was the fire prescription? Does the fire prescription limit opportunity for the desired change in community?
I'm not sure what Steve.
I guess I'm not quite sure what is meant by fire prescription.
Okay, well, Justin, if you want to type in a clarification of your question, we'll get back to that. So Brandon Napton, who had asked earlier about if there were any opportunities to look at cutting treatments, and Steve, you had said that the size of your plots had limited that. He then said that he says, our district has completed cutting treatments on approximately half of a 30,000 acre area. mostly in Miller's Phase 1 and 2 areas that have the highest likelihood of a response in the targeted species. He says,
yeah, you know, and I know that there were some fairly large areas where cutting was done. Getting back to the study design, the way this project was set up, it wasn't just to look at bird response and the scales at which we needed to see for birds, but rather much of the driving forces behind the study design were to look at vegetation response. And so many of the vegetation characteristics that the different people are looking at, whether it's Rick Miller or Dave Pike in some of the sagebrush areas, they can use fairly small areas to look at the effects in vegetation response due to cutting. So our design then was to focus on the burn treatment as the influence on bird communities, although it did include, for those looking at thresholds for a vegetation response, it did include some smaller core plots within which the different kinds of treatments, whether it was mechanical like cutting, were conducted. So we really didn't have the opportunity to go into some of those larger cutting areas and look at bird response.
Okay. He says he'd love to discuss more offline, so.
Okay.
Great. Okay, and then Justin Feeman clarified, he had asked what was the fire prescription, and he says prescription timing and the timing and intensity of the fire. That's what he's wondering. And did that limit opportunity for the desired change in the community?
Well, certainly a fall burn, and the timing is going to give you a different response than if you could burn, you know, earlier in the summer. We were hindered in some of that just by some people opposed to having the burns necessarily the size or where we wanted to have those burns. The prescription, I'm not sure what the prescription was, if it was, you know, in terms of the percent of the vegetation that was to be reduced as a result of the burn, but so they may have met their objective in removing some of the juniper. And from a vegetation response, the kind of things that we're looking at on the vegetation side of things, the level of burn may have been totally adequate to, for instance, because they could select sites then that were completely burned. But at the area over which the birds operate, we didn't have that level of complete burn that we would have needed to see some of the responses. So they could have met their prescription, both in terms of timing and the structure changed, and parts of that would have been suitable for vegetation, but not for the bird communities.
Okay. Thanks. Julie Thompson asked, would a 1,000-acre mechanical treatment be large enough to implement a similar study design as yours?
Yes, I definitely think it would. And whether or not, see, the other thing would be whether or not we'd have the opportunity to do pre-treatment as well as post-treatment. One of the challenges we had in this is then having the treatments planned with sufficient time to do at least 1 year of pre-treatment information. And so if there are large cuttings that are being planned, and we would have the opportunity to go in and do some pre-treatment surveys, that would certainly be of help. I should point out that the level of the study too is much deeper than just the point counts that I've talked about today, but includes territory mapping and changes in demographics, nest searches, and things like that. So the scope of what we did on the bird project, to be able to do that on some area that was cut would take a substantial amount of funding to be able to duplicate what we've done on this project.
Thank you. Going back to responding to the previous question about the prescribed fire, it says William Dratt, but then in parentheses it says Jeff Rose, so it might be Jeff Rose. Says the management objectives for the juniper reduction were met on 5 creeks. The 5 Creeks fire occurred in October 2008, and the temperatures were between 65 and 80 degrees, winds 10 to 15 miles per hour, and RH less than 15%. It is a balance between achieving the goals and holding the fire within the unit. So that was the prescription, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay. Well, that looks like it. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. And again, if you have questions that come up later, please email at any time. And again, the video and presentation will be posted soon. So thank you very much, Steve, for your webinar today. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Well, everyone have a great day and very happy holidays. We'll see you in the new year. All right. Bye.
Goodbye.